So how I first met Albie was I was a second-year law student at Hastings in San Francisco. So we're talking 1974. And Albie came to the United States in part to gain support for the South African anti-apartheid movement. He was living in exile at the time. And what was the beginning of the divestment program. So I was, an anti-apartheid person, but I didn't know anybody else from South Africa. So Albie was really my connection to that movement. And when we met, the goal was for us to introduce him to people and figure out how to find more support for the work he was doing in support of the anti-apartheid movement. So that's initially how we met, which is, now close to 40 years ago.
Remember Abby, very sparky, very bright, very California, although she's not from California, and there was a kind of an energy and a vitality that was very attractive. And you felt right, these are not just heavy people saying apartheid is terrible. These were energetic Americans fighting for justice in the United States and linking up with us, and so the energy flowed both ways.
Let me just say, sort of from the American perspective, what it meant to, quote, put our bodies on the line. I mean, I'm sitting here in Washington, D.C., remembering May Day, 1971. But that meant, throwing a few big garbage cans into the street, stopping some traffic, and then running in the other direction when the cops started to chase us. It was a very different form of kind of sporadic activism that occasionally, I got arrested in Washington, but I've only gotten arrested once. Nobody put me in solitary confinement. Everybody thought our civil rights had been abused by virtue of the fact that they kept us in pretty bad conditions for all of 36 hours. Albie was in jail in solitary confinement for 168 days for doing the kind of work that we would have done in the United States and not been prosecuted for. So it was a completely different world. And the risks that somebody like Albie and others took in South Africa were completely different. So, I think I took a risk getting arrested in Washington, D.C., but it was nothing. And that was part of why I wanted to make this film, was to say, look, here are some people whose lives were on the line for, 30 years, and this is what it cost them, but look what they were able to achieve by keeping a vision of democracy alive, keeping hope alive for their country.
The risks as a child weren't to do with politics. Just being a bit different and being willing to live with being different. And we didn't celebrate birthdays, we didn't do all the routine things that the other families did, but we had dreams of a free world, and the people who came to visit, they were all energetic and bright, and there was a kind of activity that emanated from them. My mum and my dad split up when I was very young, so most of my mom's friends were women activists. So I became a feminist just by immersion, just by the people who were around, people who were involved in a strike, involved in this action, the other action. And these weren't demure women at home complaining about this, that, and the other. These were bright, active, lots of laughter, lots of energy, and lots of hope. And I think that's what shaped me. My dad was a trade union organizer. My mom worked for a black political leader, Moses Katani. So the racism thing wasn't a challenge for me. That was normal. And the world outside there seemed to be sort of abnormal. And I had to, in that sense, incorporate in myself and my being, and also in relation to questions of religion and ambition and so on in life, things that were particular to me. But my deep dreams were to be maybe a scientist discovering a microbe smaller than Louis Pasteur had discovered, or maybe Jules Verne, I was reading, flying to the moon, going beyond. Even when I used to go out into the sea, I would always like to go a little further than anybody else. Not dangerous, but just a little further, just to test that sense of just not being bounded by limits and expectations, but also not being reckless. And it's rather terrifying to think at the age of 6 and 7 I was already doing that kind of balancing. I was afraid that my courage would go. Afraid, because that was the choice. I don't complain. I got blown up. I nearly lost an arm. I felt fantastic. I survived. because I was a volunteer. I wasn't oppressed because I was who I was. For the great majority of people, they didn't have a choice. I volunteered, and in a sense, it's enormously elating to feel that you're guiding your life, you're making choices, you're following something inside that's very, very meaningful. And then the test is, will I be strong enough? If they come for me, will I be brave? Will I get through? Will I survive? And I survived. I felt fantastic. I woke up, I've only lost an arm. That was like a victory for me. And it was terrible in solitary confinement. On a good day, I would just be depressed. And that's on a good day. You know, it was down below what I'd imagined. All the words, liberation, freedom, justice, just disappear. You're in a tiny little world, self-referential, enclosed world, where these words, you vaguely remember that they were important, but some kind of inner determination not to give way, not to collapse, a kind of almost childish pride counted for more than the ideology and the phrases. That's what solitary confinement does to you. But the other big thing was you meet fantastic people. You come almost literally out of your skin. You learn to move. You know those tight white skins that we people have. You learn to shake a little bit, to dance, to sing, to laugh, to speak, to connect up. And that's very, very reinforcing. It's kind of, wow, what an amazing, marvelous world we're living in. So these are not substitutes for courage, but they fill the space that maybe bare courage has to fill if you're completely on your own. We never felt completely on our own, except when we were in solitary confinement. I did know day and night, and I would scratch on the wall. Somehow knew that was the protocol, that's what prisoners do. So to keep track of the days. And I would get meals at a certain time, and I'd have 20 minutes exercise. So there was some structure during the day, but no one to speak to, no activity, nothing to do. Human beings are made to associate, to connect, to speak, to be angry, to express emotions. And I would sing, I would whistle, I would make up things to try and animate myself. I'd try and remember all the states in America.
And their capitals.
Not the capitals.
Oh, just the states?
Just the states.
Okay, there was the capitals.
And I would go through the A's, and I couldn't write it down, but just something to keep my mind alive. I would sing, and my first song would be Always, Because, Charmaine, Daisy. I'd go through the alphabet, and my favorite was Always. I'll be living here always, year after year, always, in this little cell that I know so well. I'll be living swell, always, always. And I would feel the snow-coward blithe spirit song that he took from Irving Berlin as a love poem is keeping the spirit alive of this prisoner in South Africa. I think the sense of humor is also very, very important. And then there was the second verse. I'll be staying in always, keeping up my chin always, not for but an hour, not for but a week, not for 90 days, but always. It was called the 90-day law. And you could be locked up for 90 days, released for 2 minutes, and locked up again. So there are things that you use. I used to hear clocks chiming, and to this day, I still remember, if I hear the carillon, I get goose flesh. On Sundays, I would hear church bells ringing, and instead of it being sounds of joy for me, it's a sound of isolation. It's like Pavlov's dogs, you know, are trained to associate sound with certain emotions. Things like that stuck with me. I remember when I was moved from one prison to the other, sitting in the car that was taking me and being astonished to see the driver stopping at the traffic lights. There's nothing like that in prison. It's shouting, screaming, domination, door slamming, and here's a world where you stop because the right light is red. It was just like, wow, this is kind of unbelievable. So there are a lot of things that got deep into me. The worst moment by far was the sleep deprivation, where I eventually collapsed, fell onto the ground, water is poured on me, I'm lifted up, my eyes are pushed open, I collapse again a few times, and I feel myself breaking. It's a kind of humiliation that to this day I haven't really overcome.
My first attempt to reach him wasn't so successful, which was I Googled him. I knew nothing about South African names and did not know that somebody named Henry van der Weisthuizen was like somebody named Henry Smith in the United States. So my first attempt was no good, and I found a 31-year-old who'd never heard of Albie Sachs and said, and I certainly was not involved in an assassination attempt. Through Albie, I actually reached the real Henry. And he agreed, to show up for this interview. And my belief as to why he agreed to do it is that he is in his own way, trying to do things that further his sense that Albie will someday forgive him. In a sense that Albie's sense of forgiveness is quite different from Henry's. But I think that's why he came. What I found about him is that I don't know people like Henry, who was a military intelligence agent, and who really felt, as part of his job, he was trying to save South Africa from internal and external threats, so that the black anti-apartheid movement and its white supporters that were trying to topple the apartheid regime that he worked for were threats that deserved to be annihilated. And he goes so far as to say, we would draw up a list of people and decide who was the next to be exterminated. So eliminated, not exterminated, excuse me, eliminated. So that tells you something about the kind of mindset that he came from. On the other hand, what I would say about Henry is that he was one of the few people from military intelligence who actually went to the TRC, decided that he would go to the TRC and tell his story. And before he did that, he went and met Albie. So there was
TRC is
the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, where people would be able theoretically to get amnesty if they went and told the truth about the activities they had been involved in. Well, it was not something that many people from the service that he was part of, which is sort of like the CIA, did. So this was a guy that was trying to find some kind of path to the new South Africa for himself. He lost his job as a result of the end of the apartheid regime. He's doing various activities that are definitely under the radar. But I appreciated his coming. I feel like he is who he is, and he presented himself as he is on camera. And I felt like he was truthful. And I just was really glad that I had this opportunity. I was extremely kind of nervous for me going in. I've done millions of interviews, but I don't normally interview perpetrators. I don't normally get to, and so here was my chance. And I felt like in my editing, I was interested in sharing the Henry that I met in this interview with the audience. And it's a little bit like what you see is what you get. It wasn't like there was a lot of chit-chat off camera between us. He's a kind of straight-laced, little bit ramrod kind of guy. And so it wasn't like we became friends, and it wasn't as if anything changed as a result of this interview, but I was very glad that he agreed to cooperate, and to this day we don't know if he's seen the film. So he has not been at any public screenings in South Africa that I know of.
He came in
66.
Very hard year for me, and for our movement generally. Our leaders were locked up, Robben Island, people were cracking up, people were being tortured to death, and suddenly here's this American senator. We're all very, very skeptical. Why did they let him in? Normally they didn't let in people if they didn't have a kind of guarantee. They'll say it's not so bad and they're trying hard and you have to have constructive engagement and you have to speak nicely to them. In the end he came. At the beginning it still wasn't all that clear, and within a couple of days it was quite remarkable. From being rather tentative, there was an authority and a connection, and what was amazing for me was how the students themselves responded. And partly he had an aura, he found the language, partly he was immune. He could say things that we all knew and we all felt. He was a visitor, he wanted to do it in a kind of diplomatic way, but a forceful way. And it was a thrilling time for us. We wanted good news, and many of us believed that there was another side to America than the America that was somehow defending apartheid and preventing sanctions and so on. And here was the other America. And the final speech that he made is remembered to this day. People say, I was there, I was there, I was there, at that meeting at the University of Cape Town. People felt it was a message to us in South Africa, but a message that was kind of to the world, a message of hope in a very, very bleak time. I believe now this theme of the ripples,
The ripple of hope.
the ripple of hope is actually literally marked in the stone at the Kennedy Memorial, but it truly was a ripple of hope for us in South Africa, and it's very marvelous for me to think that while we're doing this interview, it would be in the 90th birthday of Robert Kennedy. Members of the family will be attending the screening, and for me, Albie, as a South African, it's a very special connection.